So we're going to talk about death, life's one great inevitability. Everything that's alive will die, and it's one of the things our kids have to learn about, as hard as it might be. So in this seminar, we're going to talk about how we lay the foundation for death. How do I help my child to grasp this difficult concept? How do I explain all the things that accompany death, like caskets and funerals and burials and things like that, the spirit, the soul? And what do we do if somebody close to our children dies? How about when a pet dies? We've got lots of things that we have to talk about today. So let's get started. You know, there's an assumption that we should shield our children from many of the harsh realities of life. And of course, it's hard when we allow them to experience it, but death is one of those realities of life that children really do have to learn about. And it's so much easier to learn, well, if death is easy to learn about, but it will be easier for them to begin to grasp the concept if we take the time and allow them to experience the concepts around death from an early age. And here's what I mean. Death has kind of replaced sex as the great unmentionable. It makes parents very uncomfortable to have to talk about death because, of course, it makes us so sad. What a sad reality that we have to talk about. So many parents actually avoid the topic altogether, and that's a mistake. It's hard to accept death for anybody. In fact, there are people who spend their whole lives trying to research and understand it, writing great books about it. Nobody really gets it, and nobody really knows what it's about. But we need to help our children to have a concept of death, because for sure they're going to wonder about it. That I can promise you. And most children start wondering about death and several other things, like sex and about God and all kinds of big concepts around the age of 4. It's a very typical age when children begin to ask questions. What does it mean to be dead? What does a dead person look like? What happens to your body after you've died? Things like that. So it's tricky, this death question, because we have our own feelings about death. We have our own fears and anxieties and sadnesses about death. And in our luggage, we carry around with us all the time. We all have luggage that we carry with us. We have all of those ideas already in there because in that luggage is what our mother told us about death, or what our father told us, or what happened when our dog died, or when the bird died, or when grandma died. We have all these ideas that we carry with us that flavor our ability to handle death, in addition to flavoring our ability to explain death or help our children come to understand death in the way that they need to. So our answers to our questions about death when we talk to our children, when we help them to learn, have everything to do with what we have in our luggage and what our experience has been. Before we begin to explain death to our kids, it's really important that you get a grip on your own feelings about it. Because the one thing I know for sure is that right now death is not a loaded topic for your kids. It will become loaded as they begin to realize that death is the ultimate separation and how sad that really is when they imagine it. But it's not something that's heavy. Hearing about killing or shooting or dying or dead things isn't something that's loaded or scary for them yet. So you need to get your own feelings about death, not necessarily under control, but you need to deal with them and confront them and have a handle on it before we begin to explain to your child what death is or deal with his learning process. Your true feelings will leak, I can promise you that. So it's important that you be authentic in your conversations. Kids spot inconsistencies and hypocrisy as quickly as you do. So the degree of difficulty you have in handling this will be reflected in what you say to your kids. So let's start by taking care of you and your feelings about death. So, as I just explained, death isn't a loaded topic for our kids, but nonetheless, we have to be careful how we describe it and kind of be mindful of the words that we use. But think of this, when you're describing death to your children, if you used hush voices and low, sad tones with your kids, they're going to think it's something different than you want it to be for them as they begin to understand it. You play the biggest role in your child's ability to understand death and to learn about it. And don't you forget that, because you are going to lay the foundation for your child's ability to understand it as he moves forward. And learning about death is just like learning about anything. The way children learn is that they get a concept in their head. Let's call it a framework. Maybe they hear something for the first time, and it forms a little space in their brains. We'll call it death. And then every time they hear that word, death or dead or something about it, it gets put in that concept, in that framework in their brain. It's called assimilating and accommodating information. And we're going to do that with our kids as they begin to learn about death. Give them little pieces of information and gradually build that framework so they have a reference point when it comes to talking about death. So now I want to talk to you about how children learn about death from a developmental perspective, because children of different ages obviously can understand the concept differently, and in fact they do. We can't control when a child will be exposed to death. Unfortunately, some children are exposed very young, if a family member dies, or even if a fish or a pet dies. And some really won't have to confront it on a personal basis until a much older age. But let's talk about what the ages are and how children understand it step by step. Let's begin with our youngest kids, our 1 to 2-year-olds. Here's the thing of it. They don't get it, period. When someone dies, he's gone, and that's as much as a child understands. You know, before I move on to the older ages, I want to say this other thing. Nobody really understands death. I know I mentioned that before, but people spend their whole lives, philosophers, trying to figure it out. So it's kind of crazy for us to think our kids are going to understand it, but we're going to still give them the benefit, not of the doubt, but the benefit of learning a little bit, as much as they can. Okay, so that was 1 and 2-year-olds. 2.5-year-olds to 5-year-olds, they think of death as something that's reversible, something that happens to somebody. It's not final, and they expect the person is going to return. They don't think that death happens to everybody. They think it just happens to certain people, and they're not really sure why. They think of it as kind of accidental or incidental. And children this age believe that his or her actions might actually have to do with the fact that somebody died. Like, I didn't eat my vegetables, so Grandma died, or something like that. Or if I had gone to her house and visited, maybe she wouldn't have died. Sad, but sometimes true. Children this age engage in something called wish fulfillment. You know, maybe if I wish hard enough, Uncle Jack will come back. And they believe that they have that power. These kids also think of death as living in another place. What do dead people do? Who takes care of them? What do dead people eat when they're not here anymore? They're trying so hard to figure it out. You know, there's this great story that I tell of a mom who gives a wonderful long explanation to her 4.5-year-old, actually, and that's almost 5, about how Grandpa had died and he's not going to see him anymore and he won't be here and his body had stopped living, no sleeping and no talking and no moving, all the things I'm going to tell you that we talk to kids about. And after this explanation was all done, the child asked, but how is he going to get food to live if he's inside of a casket? So they get it and they don't get it, those little kids. 5 years old is a very concrete age. Don't be frightened by that, but understand that the 5-year-olds, they want to see the dead person. They want to know what it's like. They want to know very specific, concrete questions. And that's because they're in their concrete stage of development. Some parents are put off by that and they think it's like crazy or morose or gross, but it isn't at all. It's your 5-year-old child trying to wrap his arms around this very, very difficult concept. A child of 5 might ask, well, where did Grandpa go? What does it feel like to be dead? Where is he now? What is he doing? They're trying so hard to get it. And in particular, the 5-year-olds, if not even earlier, will want to know what happens to the body. Well, where is his body and what does it look like and what's going on with that body? That's part of being concrete. Don't be repulsed by this. As I said, it's just your child around the age of 5 trying to wrap his arms around this concept. The 6 to 8-year-old child sees it slightly differently. The 6 to 8-year-old sees that death is final and that it is irreversible. But he may think that death doesn't happen to everybody, but maybe just some people. Interestingly, this age child might personify death as being the Grim Reaper or the boogeyman or some ghost kind of thing that sneaks up on people and grabs them away and takes them. 6 to 8-year-olds often feel or can feel that death is contagious and it's something that they might catch, and it makes them very uncomfortable. They also, much like the younger child, may see that they're responsible for the death of a person. I told Tommy that I wished he were dead and 2 weeks later he died. Something like that wouldn't be atypical. Just telling you in case that happens. And these children of this age are confused by our words, which is one of the reasons I say you have to be so careful in the words that you choose in your explanations. Saying things to a child like, well, Uncle Harry went on a long journey. He doesn't understand that. What do you mean he went on a long journey? Why isn't he here? I don't get that. It's not like he went on a business trip or a vacation. Then we have our 9 to 11-year-olds. They take it up to another level. These kids understand that death is final and it's irreversible. They kind of get that. And they get that it happens to everyone. The 9 to 11-year-old has a heightened sense of his own fragility and his own vulnerability. And as such, when it comes to death, he has a fear of great bodily harm that may include death. Am I going to die? Might this happen? Will I die from that? 9 to 11-year-old might even think of death as a punishment for his own bad behavior, which is like horror of horrors, but he just might think that. Because 9 to 11s kind of feel guilty about their thoughts, and maybe they feel that their reluctance to visit a sick parent in the hospital, grandparent in the hospital, or something like that actually may have contributed to the death of that person. These 9 to 11-year-olds have a very strong interest in the environment that surrounds death. And they're curious about the details about death, the biological details and the physical details. And they're very curious about funerals, about dead bodies, about cemeteries, about burials, and all that stuff. 9 to 11-year-olds magnificently become concerned about relationships. And that child might say, well, who's going to take care of grandma if grandpa died? Who's going to be her friend, and who's going to bring her food? Because they have an awareness of how the loss of that person affects the people around them. So death and aging obviously go hand in hand. But our kids don't really know too much about aging, actually, especially in the world we live in today, and especially in our big cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, New York, and big cities where people are very conscious of appearances. Our kids today are much more removed from aging. They don't get to see it. We don't live with our old people as they die. You know, there used to be a time when people actually lived with their aging parents. They brought them to stay with them, or an aging aunt or uncle, and children had the benefit of actually seeing what it looks like to get old, how their faces get mapped with wrinkles and their hair turns gray. In today's world, by the way, how many people have gray hair? Me? Anyone else? Not many, because today children see that people's bodies are all looking pretty young. Another thing is that death today happens in hospitals, in rest homes. Children are very removed from death, and they're very removed from aging, so they don't see the buildup to death as it happens. And they're not exposed to that aging process, as I said. So the way children see it, as I've explained, first you're young, and then you're mommy, and then you're old and you die, but they don't really get to see the old part of it. It's kind of tricky. And it's not really fair to our kids that they don't get to see what an old person looks like. They don't get to see people walking with canes. They don't see a lot of that oldness, as I've said. I want to tell you a funny story. When my kids were little, my daughter had something that was really old-fashioned called an add-a-pearl. And when a girl child was born, she was given a necklace with one pearl on it. And each year on her birthday, she was given another pearl. So my husband and I did that with our daughter. And each year on her birthday, she would get another pearl. And on her 5th birthday, we ceremoniously gave her her necklace. She opened the box with her brothers watching. Remember, I have those triplets, so they all turned 5 on the same day. But only my daughter got the add-a-pearl necklace. And she opened it up and she saw the necklace. She put it on and she counted the pearls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the boys looked at it and we talked about 5 pearls, 5 years old. And it was wonderful. The next week it was Mother's Day and we were invited to a party at a relative's house. And we walked in and there was an older woman at the party. She was tall, magnificent, thin. She wore her hair back in a bun, gray hair, very gray. A very mapped, beautiful, stately woman with lots of wrinkles. And she had on a pearl necklace. And my son went up to her and he looked at her and he said, "You must be very old." And the woman, without missing a beat, said, "Well, I am. How do you know?" And he said, "Because your pearls are so long." She was wearing opera-length pearls, and he knew that each pearl represented a year in his world. It was a great, great message to me about children don't really look at old people as old, and they're certainly not exposed to them, because this lady really was old. So kids aren't really exposed to death, and they're not exposed to the dying process because we put our old people away, sadly. And they don't see the aging process because nobody looks old anymore. But the reality is, on top of that, we avoid the topic of death. We don't talk about it. Parents say in horror, "I'm not going to talk about death. No, my child shouldn't learn about that." Not so, not true, as I've said over and over. We think we're protecting our children from the reality that death happens, but in fact, we're robbing them of the opportunity to learn about it. Here's another story. When I was a director of a school, one of my classrooms, classroom of 4-year-olds, had goldfish. And the reason they had goldfish is one of the mommies had won them at a fair, at a carnival. That's why I love carnivals, because we have goldfish and we get to see them die. Ooh, sounds morbid, I know. But this mommy brought in some goldfish into the classroom. And the kids named them like Goldie and Harry or something like that. And every day they took care of them. And one day I came into school before the kids had arrived, even before the teachers, like always. And I noticed that either Goldie or Harry was floating on the top of the water. I looked at it and I thought, oh my gosh, great, we're going to learn about death today. Great experience. And I left the goldfish to float on top because I wanted the children to discover it. The children arrived, and so did the mother who had given the classroom the goldfish. And she saw with horror what had gone on, that one of them had died. And I took this mommy outside and I said, oh please, don't worry about it. It's a wonderful thing. It's an opportunity for us to begin to teach our children about death. It's great. And the mother looked at me in horror, thinking I was really crazy. Pause. The children went out for their recess time. Lo and behold, when they came back in from their playtime outside, which had been about an hour, the fish was now alive. What had happened? The mother had run to the pet store and bought a new goldfish. Forget the problems that created for me and for the teachers in having to explain what had gone on. But I was so sad because I thought this mother cannot allow her children to learn about this wonderful, difficult part of life. Not really wonderful, mainly difficult, because it's so hard for her to imagine it. So many parents don't even talk to their kids about death. They kind of avoid the topic altogether. They don't talk to kids about funerals. They don't take their kids to funerals. Many of them don't even tell kids when death has occurred. Someone, a dog or a relative who was distant or whom they might not have known. And they certainly don't show their own grief to their children. I had a client who told me an amazing story about what they do in Japan, which was new to me. I didn't know this story. He had taken his 4-year-old child to Japan for his grandmother's funeral. And he said it was an amazing experience because in Japan, all of the family goes to the funeral. The young children are not shielded from this. And in fact, with his grandmother, the entire family came, old people adults, teens, young people, they all went to the funeral. And they all first went to the crematorium where the grandmother's body was going to be disposed of via cremation. And everybody watched the grandmother's body being loaded into the flames. And they waited around while grandmother's body was actually burned. And then they took the ashes out. And then apparently there was some amazing ceremony where the grandmother's bones were built up in a structure of some kind. I don't remember exactly how he described it. And then there was a particular bone that was passed around from person to person who was at the funeral, which apparently is why people who are authentically Japanese don't like to pass things with their chopsticks, because they use the chopsticks to pass the bone around. And then people talked about Grandma, and they talked about her life and her death, and then the whole family went and buried the bones. I heard this story, and the people in the parenting group I was doing heard this story, and we were all amazed. But what it said to me was, because it's what they do, it wasn't something that was horrifying to the child, because he had seen the process from a very young age all the way up. It makes me think about how they do it in India, where there are funeral pyres and people see that people get cremated. But that's India and that's Japan. And here in America, let me just say, we don't talk about cremation as a part of death. Not yet, not for a long time. It's hard enough to learn about death, but to learn about cremation and burning, I think that's a bit much. Not talking about death builds barriers to many things. Not only the child's ability to understand death, but it builds a barrier to his communication with you. Because as I say in all of my seminars, we want our children to know that they can come to you and ask you anything, and that you will tell them the truth about it. So not talking about it doesn't give them that message. Most adults, however, don't really know how to talk about death. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're afraid that they might use the wrong word or have the wrong script, and that makes it uncomfortable. On top of that, they're afraid that they're going to cause their child pain, and nobody likes to see her child in pain. But children do need to be spoken to. Okay, they need to have a context in which to understand death, and that's how this is going to begin. Before they can experience the loss of somebody they know, or even they've heard of, they have to have a concept. They have to have that framework I discussed before in order to have a place to put the information you're going to give them. So as I said, around the age of 4, the age of questions, children are going to become curious about death. Some even become obsessed about it, which bothers parents, and it shouldn't. It's just their interest and their understanding. But they become really interested, and they're going to ask lots of questions. This is totally normal. It shouldn't freak you out. It shouldn't scare you. Your child isn't having emotional problems. Don't be horrified about this, because it's what children do. They're interested in death. You know, it really shouldn't surprise us that it's 4-year-olds who become interested in death, because 4 years old is just after your child has begun mastering separation. Started nursery school, at preschool, you left him at school, you leave him when you go out at night. There's a lot of separation that goes on with our young children, and death is, after all, the final separation. So it should come as no surprise to any of us that that's the age at which children are so curious about death, and that they're interested in it. It is the ultimate separation. And it makes sense that a child would worry about it and be obsessed about it, because that separation is from you, and you are the dearest thing to your child. The thing about explaining death is that it can't be explained in one single heavy burst. You don't sit your child down and say, "Now, dear, I need to tell you something. I'm going to tell you about death." It doesn't happen that way at all. It needs to filter through a growing child from the beginning of her life. So parents and teachers are going to provide sensible answers to occasional questions at each child's own pace and own level. We're not going to tell them more than they need to know, but we're going to respect them and their development by answering their questions as they come up. Keeping quiet about death is not going to prevent your child from learning about it, wondering about it, or knowing about it. In fact, your silence about death only leaves your child alone with her fantasies, terrified by the fear that she senses in you. So unanswered questions will lead to unasked questions. And I think that's the worst thing of all, because we want our kids to ask us questions so we can answer them and help them along. We want to create a climate for our children that encourages and welcomes the asking of questions. We want them to know that we are here and we welcome their questions and we will always answer them. No question is too big, too scary, too yucky, too personal for a parent. So here's what children need to know. Kids need to know that everything that is alive will die. It's kind of the long and short of it, right? Everything that's alive will die. That's called a life cycle. And when we teach kids about a life cycle, which we do, we teach them that everything starts as an infant, as a baby, and it begins to grow, and it becomes a child size, and it becomes a teenager size, and a grown-up size, and then it gets old, and then it dies. And every living creature, everything that is alive has this life cycle. We also need to teach our kids, and I'm going to go into this more in a bit, but we need to teach our kids that dead means something is all done living. That's all that it means. It was alive and now it's dead. A framework is being created for this at the very beginning when a child is as young as 15, 18 months old. That's when we begin to teach this. None of it's too early because a child's attitude about death is being shaped by us, by our attitude about death and how we communicate with our child about it. So how do we create that foundation to understand death? There are lots of things that we do starting at that very early age that I just said. We need to find all of those teachable moments to introduce the concept. So for example, in the fall, when you see the leaves falling off the trees, oh, the leaves have died. They're falling off the tree. They're all done living. Or when you see a flower that's fallen off a bush, oh, the flower died. It's all done living. Look, it's fallen off. And that's the life cycle that we want to point out to our child at every opportunity. First it was a bud, and then it bloomed into a full-blown rose, and then it started to get droopy, and then it died, and it fell off the rose plant. That's called a life cycle. When you see a dead snail, don't hurry by it. Point out that the snail has died. After the rain, when there's a worm that's dead, and we see lots of them after a rain, stop and say, oh look, the worm has died. Maybe there's a moth on your windowsill or a fly. You can take it and put it in your hand. You can say, look, this fly has died. He's all done living. Yes, you can wash your hands when you're done. Don't freak out. But that way a child can see what it looks like to be dead and add to his framework in his head about what it means to be dead. It's all done living. When you see a bird that has died, you can say, that birdie died. He's dead. He's all done living. Keep the fly. Now this also means as we begin to teach our children about death, you need to create a reverence for life. So you're going to have to put that Raid bug spray away. You're going to have to hide your fly swatter. Because if we're teaching about life and death and the life cycle, you can't go around squashing flies and worms and bees. You're going to have to learn to take those spiders and let them live outside. And maybe when the child isn't around, you can thwack those flies. So we want to give a child this context for understanding the idea of dead. And now you've begun because you're not afraid of using the real words. Dead, death, dying. We don't say the pretend words. We don't say going on a journey, as I mentioned before. And we're creating that reverence for life, as I also just mentioned. Let me add here, this is a good time to start having pet funerals. That burial at sea that we do with our goldfish in the toilet, no more. I think that pet funerals are a great idea. Sometimes I wonder if the people at the school of which I'm no longer the director realize that there is a cemetery in the parking lot. Jumper the frog, Goldie the goldfish, a couple of silkworm moths. We had a lot of funerals at that school. So you can take a box and put the dead fly in a box and take it out to the garden and dig a hole and talk about that you're sorry that fly's life is over. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's how we begin to teach our children about death and about funerals and what happens to living things after they have died. You know, I really do love carnivals for exactly the reason that you can get goldfish and they're going to come home and they're going to live about 2 days. All right, there's the occasional guy that hangs on and grows and grows and grows with every bowl that you have, but they usually die. It's a good thing. It's an opportunity to learn about death and to have a little pet funeral. We're going to allow our kids to know when things died. We're not going to be like that mother who replaced the goldfish. Allow your children to know about when your pet has died. We're going to talk more about when pets die a little bit later. But for now, let me say, please don't be in a hurry to get a new cat or a new dog or a new bird or a new goldfish as soon as the pet dies. Let a little space be there, because we want our children to realize that even though something dies, it lives on in our hearts and in our memories. That's part of how we teach children about the concept of soul or spirit. And nobody and nothing is replaceable. And if you run right out and get a new whatever, the child will then get the idea that people, things, animals can be replaced. And you and I both know that they cannot. So, what children need to know is this. Everything has a lifespan. All living creatures have a lifespan. Elephants, turtles, people, flowers, worms, silkworm moths, mosquitoes, ants, everything that is alive has a lifespan. And that means that's how long that creature is going to live, from when it was very little until it gets very, 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 very old and finally dies. They need to know that usually things that are very little have very short lifespans, like flies, and the silkworm goes from being a worm to a chrysalis to a moth in just 3 weeks' time. It's born, it spins, it flies, it lays eggs, and it dies. It's a short time. So they can understand that bigger creatures usually have longer lifespans. And it's important for them to know that, because it helps them to begin to understand that you, as a mommy, as a big mommy and a big daddy, are going to have a long lifespan. You're going to live a long, long time. Begin to help children to notice the different lifespans. Point out old people. We've already talked about how hard it is to find them on the street. But when you see an old person who looks like an old person, you can say that person's gotten very old. Look, parts of his body is not working so well. He uses that cane to help him walk. So children can begin to understand and see what old looks like. When you have a toy that isn't working so well, like maybe the wheels aren't turning as well, allow it to be there and say, well, that toy has gotten old. We've used it so much, it doesn't work as well as it used to. And so is the way with people's bodies. As we get older, and I can vouch for this one, things hurt and don't work as well as they used to. And we need to help our kids to understand and to learn about that. And then don't be afraid of your child's comments in public, kind of like my son and the Ada Pearl story. Don't worry when a child says, that person's really old, because that's just his learning about getting old. I have had parents tell me many times that their child will have learned about getting old, and then they visit a grandparent and they say to the grandparent, you're going to be dying soon because you're old. And of course, the parent just kind of wants to disappear. But grandma knows that, and she's not offended, and you can explain it to grandma. And you can be proud of your child who's trying so hard to understand these things. To the child, remember, there's nothing bad about getting old or being dead. It's not a loaded topic for that child, not yet. So I have some guidelines for you for when your child asks questions and as he and she begin to learn about death. The first and the most important is to be factual and to be honest. Two of children's greatest needs are trust and truth, so don't blow it. When we talk to kids, keep your explanations simple and direct. When we talk too much, our kids tune us out. Don't worry about using words that they don't understand, because your child, he'll ask you what that word means. It's not a problem. Make sure that you're consistent with your answers, because the child is going to ask the same question over and over and over. Don't be worried about that. It's not that your child is not able to understand. It's that he's working on understanding. He's trying so hard to figure this out. The older your child gets, the more concrete she's going to be. And her need to know will become very specific. Blunt questions from kids require very direct and very clear answers. Don't be afraid. They're good and they're necessary, because the questions will match the child's cognitive development, and you'll be able to help him to learn at just the level he or she is able to learn. Please take pains not to use euphemisms like, the dog went to play in the country, or she passed away. I know that people say passed away. I think grown-ups are trying to be gentle, but children don't understand the idea of passed away. She died is what we say to children. I wish we could say it to adults, but mainly adults think that sounds harsh. Or she lost her father. A child doesn't understand what that means. What do you mean she lost her father? They know what getting lost means, and that's not what happened. Her father died. Euphemisms really get in the way of children's understanding, because they're trying to understand what's going on, and they already have a hard time with differentiating between reality and fantasy. So let's not make it any harder for them than it already is. And please avoid cliches like, it's all for the best, it was time, she's in a better place, you'll feel better soon. Kids don't understand any of those cliches, so save them for adults and avoid them with kids. And if you find yourself saying them, stop and explain to your child what you really mean. How can it be best for someone if he has just died and left the child? They don't get that, so don't use it. Try to understand what a child is really asking, because sometimes kids ask questions and we answer a question that's different from the one that he asked. If you don't understand what the child is asking, you can say, I'm trying to understand what your question is. Do you wonder if we're going to see Grandpa anymore? Do you wonder what's happened to Grandpa's body? I'm just trying to understand what you're asking. Alternatively, sometimes it's useful to say, well, what do you think is the answer to that question? Or what's your idea about that? Because it'll help you to know what the child already knows, and he may be coming from a totally different place, or alternatively, he may have some misinformation that you will need to clear up. I believe in something that I call, euphemistically, the drip method of explanation. I believe that you give children, for all of their learning, little bits of information at a time, whether they're learning about sex or death or God, whatever it is, the biggies that they're learning about. The child is capable of understanding and absorbing just a little bit of information at a time. It's kind of like a very dry sponge. If you have that sponge sitting on the counter, it's bone dry, and you pour water on it, most of the water will swim away. It floats off. But there are bits that get absorbed. But if you feed that dry sponge a little bit of water at a time, it will all get absorbed. So that's how we like to explain to kids about all these hard things like death. After you've said something to your child, make sure that he understands what you've just said. So you can say to him something like, so What's your idea about what I just told you? Or does that make sense to you? Or do you need me to say that again? Because that way you can gauge how much your child has gotten, and you can be sure that he's gotten what he needs to get. Here's a really important part of this. You need to be a good listener. A lot of us are not good listeners. There's a reason that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So after you talk to your child, listen, pay attention, watch, but hear what he says back, hear what he's saying, watch what he's doing, and you'll have a very good sense of how much he's taken in and what he's done with the information. Watch how your child is behaving. Growth comes through exploring the questions he's asked, and you're going to see death surface in his play. I don't want you to be horrified by this. You can expect that your child's going to pretend to be dead. Playing dead, trying to see what it feels like to be dead. Surfacing in his play, you might see shooting and killing. You're going to hear words like kill and dead, and parents are horrified by this. Don't be. It's what 4 and 5-year-olds, even 6-year-olds do as they try to wrap their arms around this very difficult concept called death. Expect those death words to show up in his vocabulary, and expect a lot of questions. This is a hard concept to understand, and he's working so hard to understand it. It's okay. It's also okay for you to admit to your child that you don't have all the answers. That even some of the people who know so much stuff don't have all the answers. You can tell your child that there are some ways that we find out answers to questions that we don't know, but that some questions we really don't have the answers for, because there really are, aren't there? If you don't know what to say when your child asks you a question, it's probably a good idea to say, you know what? I want to answer that question in a way you're going to understand. So give me a minute, I'm going to think about it. And then you can race off to this seminar, your notes, look up in a book, call me, think about it, call your friend. But whatever you do, make sure you go back to your child and you say, okay, I thought of a way to explain this that you're going to understand. Always go back to your child when she has a question. How do we explain death to kids? We know how we've prepared them. We understand how they understand it. We have laid the foundation for their beginning to understand. How do we answer death? How do we explain death? I'm going to look down at my script that I've written for you. Dead means that a person or an animal is all done living. That's it. His body has stopped working, and it won't work anymore. The body won't do any of the things that it used to do. He won't talk, he won't eat, he won't pee, he won't poop, he won't burp, he won't move, he won't blink his eyes, he won't listen. None of those things will happen because none of the parts work anymore. And you can add that the person who has died, he won't feel any of the feelings he or she used to feel, because that person is all done. All of those things have stopped. That's really tricky, isn't it? And it's hard. To the 1 or 2-year-old, you're going to say something very simple. Grandpa died. We're not going to see Grandpa anymore. But to the 2.5, to the 3, to the 4, to the 5, an adaptation of the words that I just gave you will suffice. And you can adapt it to your needs. It's meant as a jumping off point for you. I can tell you that the first thing your child is likely to say is, I don't want to die, or I don't want you to die. It's pretty typical. It's what most children will say, of course, because they're worried about that. And when your child says, I don't want to die, or I don't want you to die, you can say, well, of course you don't want to die. And of course you don't want me to die. No one wants to die, but as I told you, everything that's alive is going to die. It is really likely that the first question your child is going to ask is, am I going to die? Or are you going to die? Or is daddy going to die? Because children are very egocentric and they first think about their own needs, and he doesn't want to die and he doesn't want his mommy or daddy to die. And remember, separation has only just happened maybe a year or two ago. And they don't like being separate from you. And the idea now that they understand a little bit that death means that you're all gone and you're all done, means that he will be separated from you. So this whole thing isn't feeling very good to him. So your response is, yes, everything that is living will die someday. But I want to tell you something. Daddy and I are not going to die for a long, 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 very long, 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 long time. Now, this is really hard for a child to understand. So actually, what you can do here is you can stop, take a breath, and let's paint a picture for a child of how long will be before you die. I'm going to be your mommy for a really long time. I'm going to be your mommy until you finish nursery school, and then when you go to summer camp. And I'm going to be your mommy when you're in kindergarten. And I'm going to be your mommy when you start Boy Scouts. And I'm going to be your mommy when you play in AYSO soccer. And I'm going to be your mommy when you start playing t-ball. And I'm going to be your mommy when you're in first grade. And I'm going to be your mommy when you go to summer camp. And I'm going to be your mommy when you're in brownies. And I'm going to be your mommy when you have your first sleepover. And I'm going to be your mommy when you're second grade. And you begin to paint, and I'm not kidding, every single thing that you will experience with your child. It's going to take 20 minutes. He'll lose interest. But you'll get to the point where you say, I'm going to be your mommy when you go away to sleepaway camp. And I'm going to be your mommy when you go to high school. And I'm going to be your mommy when you go away to college. And I'll miss you, and you'll miss me, but you'll be ready. And I'm going to be your mommy when you graduate from college. And I'm going to be your mommy when you get your first job. And I'm going to be your mommy when you have a girlfriend. And I'm going to be your mommy when you have a boyfriend. I'm going to be your mommy when you decide to get married. And I'm going to be your mommy and go to your wedding. And I'm going to be your mommy when you decide to have babies. Look, I'm getting a chill when I'm talking to you. It's really exciting. And I'm going to be your mommy when you have those babies. And I'm going to be your baby's grandmommy. And I'm going to play with your babies, and I'm still going to be your mommy. So you get what I mean. You paint this picture that makes your child realize that you're going to be around for a very long, long time. But when your child asks the question, you want to give a simple, succinct, factual, honest answer. And you don't want it to be too long, because remember, children only listen to the first few words of what you're saying. And you'll say what you say, and then stop and listen and wait for your child's response. He might look at you and say, oh, okay, see, I'm going outside. Or he might give you the I don't want you to die answer. Or he might ask you more questions. I'm not really sure of what your child will do, because each child answers our questions differently. But you're going to know if your child is sated, if he's had enough for that day, because he'll move away and he'll be done. But likely he'll come back and he'll ask you more and more questions. And you're going to be able to watch your child process the concept, the idea of death, and you're going to be able to watch it surface in his play and in his talk. And you'll know that he's dealing with the concept and trying to learn it. Now here's a caveat that is so important. Please don't ever associate death with sickness or with sleeping. In other words, we don't want to say to a child, yes, he was very, very sick and he died. Because your children think of sick as having kind of a throat like I have today, or having a tummy ache, or maybe throwing up. And we certainly don't want them to think, oh my gosh, I have a tummy ache, am I going to die? And we don't want to tell them when they ask you, what does it look like when you're sick? Well, it's kind of like you're sleeping. Because then you're going to have a child who's not going to want to go to sleep, because you know what he's going to think about sleeping. Children need to know that physical death is final. And whatever you choose to teach your child about the after-death experience, and we'll talk about that in a second, she must know that that creature's body never comes back as that creature and will never come back to life or will ever have consciousness or feelings again. You know, TV cartoons kind of sabotage this reality because what happens? Bugs Bunny gets run over and he gets squashed. Roadrunner gets hammered out to smithereens, and then he kind of gets up and shakes it off. So the reality of death, it's really hard for them to see because the world doesn't paint death as death. We're going to come back to this question, especially about the afterlife experience, a little bit later, because I am going to address heaven for you a little bit later. Your child may ask you, well, where is Grandpa? Where is he? And you're going to say, well, I'm trying to understand what you mean. Do you mean where is Grandpa's all-done body? If that's what his question is, this might be the time when you get to explain the following. And again, I'm going to give you a sample script, and then you can use whatever part of it works for your child. Many people believe, I'm now talking to your child, I'm you, many people believe that there are two parts to all people. The body, that's the part we can touch and feel, and the soul, or the spirit. The body that's all done living, the empty shell of a body, is placed in a container called a casket. I take pains not to call it a box because your kid is thinking of something from Amazon, right? And we don't want to go there. In a casket. Casket is a kind of a container that's usually made of wood, and it's very beautiful. And that casket is placed in a place called a cemetery. Some people like to say is placed in the ground, in the earth, in the cemetery. I avoid the word buried because I think it's a scary word, but that's up to you. The soul part of a body, of a person, the spirit or soul, lives on in our memories and in our minds and in our hearts. Now, I'm going to go on with that in a minute, but this might be a good time to use the metaphor, no, it's not a metaphor, it's an analogy of an empty shell. You know how a crab, a hermit crab, has a shell, and he leaves his shell, and he goes off and does whatever his crabby business is, but the shell is still there in the sand. And you can say to your child, it's kind of like the hermit crab. The shell, the body is gone, but the shell is there. So the remaining body is kind of like an empty shell, and that empty shell is the part that gets put in the casket and then put in the cemetery. As I said before, I do not bring up cremation, unless of course you're in Japan or maybe in India. But I think for us here in America, that's not going to happen for a long, long time. Now, talking about the soul or the spirit is tricky because honestly, who of you really understands the soul or the spirit? This is tricky. But I explain to kids that our memories, we remember the soul or the spirit in our memories. The ideas and the memories that we have of a person actually are that person's soul or spirit. So I might say something like, do you remember what Grandpa's voice sounded like? Child will say yes. Can you think about it? Can you kind of remember it? That's Grandpa's soul living inside of you. And you can say, do you remember that Grandpa loved corned beef sandwiches? Yeah. Do you remember that Grandpa, do you remember his laugh? Do you remember how Grandpa liked to have a beer with his corned beef whenever we visited him? That's part of Grandpa that we remember. That's his soul. That's what made him special to us. And everybody has those parts. Every person has things that are just that person that we think about and we remember about him. When a child is biologically related to the person who has died, so this doesn't often work for adopted children at a young age, but when it works for children who have who are biologically related, you can get out a photograph of a child and you can show the child, look at, do you see how you have mommy's eyes or daddy's nose, or you've got my color of skin, or you've got grandpa's chin, or whatever it is? That's actually part of grandma's soul or my soul that lives inside of you. So what we think about people, our memories are the soul, and sometimes the way we look are part of the soul. It's a great thing to tell your child, you know, the soul or the spirit, the way that person lives on inside of us is just one of the ways that people remember other people and how people live on in other people. That's part of our heritage. That's part of who we are from generation to generation. It's actually pretty magnificent. Now I've got something great for you to do that's going to help your children to understand soul or spirit in a different way. You're going to put on your scientist hat with your child and do a little science experiment. You get a glass of water, maybe a plain small glass, transparent. And into that water, actually you're going to let your child taste the water. What is it, water? Then you take out your canister of sugar. You let your child taste it. What is it? Sugar. Ah, okay. You take a spoonful of sugar, make sure the water's warm so it will dissolve, and you mix in the sugar, enough so that it will be sweeter water. And you stir it and you stir it and you stir it until it's dissolved. And you say to the child, look, where's the sugar? And the child, depending upon the age, will say, it's gone. Or an older child might say, it's dissolved. It's gone. Well, it's gone. Where is it? It's gone. So then you'd say to the child, here, have a taste. He tastes it and he says, it's sweet. Well, why is it sweet? Well, because we put sugar in there. Wait a minute. It's in there, but we can't see it? It's kind of like a person's soul or a spirit. It's in there, but we can't see it. By the way, I use that same experiment to explain love to kids. It's in there, but you can't see it. But that's a great one to help, because the soul is a hard thing to explain. Death is a hard question to explain. We explain it in the best way that we can, with honesty, with few words, with the drip method, slowly. Here's where I want to talk to you about heaven. And I don't want to step on anybody's toes, and I don't want to step on the toes of anyone who may believe in reincarnation or afterlives or souls coming back in hummingbirds or whatever it may be. But remember, we're talking to young children who want to know the facts. And we don't want to challenge them by giving them something to understand that is way beyond their capacity. When I talk to you about heaven, you already have your idea about heaven. And I think actually that most adults, when we talk about heaven, they're thinking of that movie with Warren Beatty with all the clouds and people are kind of hopping around on clouds. I must say, when I'm in an airplane and I see clouds, I do wonder if that's what heaven looks like. At any rate, we're not going to go there with our children, because to a child, if we say, when the child says, but where is Grandpa? If we say, he's gone to heaven, the child will wonder, but why would Grandpa want to leave me? And you'll say, well, he's going to see you later when you go to heaven. And that's going to create a whole other can of worms for your child. I hope I'm not offending anybody who is religious. And you can talk with your clergy person about this. But my feeling for now with your young children is do not mix the heaven question into this explanation. Nor do I believe you should mix in the reincarnation question or people coming back as different creatures. It's enough for your child simply to have to understand death. We don't want to complicate their ability to understand death. This is really tricky business. We want to give them as much as we can without scaring them, without frightening them, but to help them to understand this difficult concept. Now, each one of us is going to have her own opinion and her own idea. And as I said, this is just a starting point for you, a jumping off point, so you can craft your answers in the way that's going to be best for your child. Let's talk about what to say when somebody dies before that person is old. Sadly, it does happen. And too often I get calls from school directors or teachers asking me, okay, how do I explain this one? Because that is a sad reality of life. Sometimes people die before they have gotten old, and it's a heartbreak. But death is death, regardless of how old the person is when he dies. And all the same explanations are going to hold true. This one, however, is a much trickier explanation. So in this case, you might want to say something like this. Sarah had a problem with her body. Now, did you notice I didn't say Sarah was sick or Sarah had a bad illness? I said Sarah had a problem with her body. The doctors tried very hard to fix that problem. They did everything that they could, but they couldn't fix it, and the parts of Sarah's body couldn't work, and she could not live, and she died. I even feel sad saying that to you, but it is the truth, and it does happen. But it is important for you to add to this explanation. Usually this does not happen. Most times people live until they are very, 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 very old. But once in a while, a person will have a problem that a doctor cannot fix, and that person is not able to live anymore, and she or he dies. Now I want to talk to you about what to do when a pet dies. And I hope that actually you're going to have a pet who dies before you have a person who dies, because somehow it does help in the explanation with a person. It's kind of easier to take, as sad as it is, when a pet dies than when a person dies. But a pet dying is still profoundly sad for a child, especially if that pet has been in the child's life for his whole life or for many years. It's hard. It's sad. He's not going to see that pet anymore. Please, please steer clear of expressions like, we're going to put him down or put him to sleep. That would be a bad one. But if you know that a pet is getting old or has an illness and he's going to die, it's a good idea to start preparing the child by saying things like, oh, I see that Rover's body is really starting to not work so well. He's getting old and he just doesn't run like he used to be able to run. Or Rover sure is sleeping a lot. I guess he's getting old. Or, oh gosh, look how hard it is for Rover to get up. His legs are just not working like they used to work. And so we begin to kind of prime it so a child understands that Rover is starting to get old. If Rover has an illness and you know it's coming, it is important for you to tell the child that Rover has a problem with his body, and the vet has said, well, actually, when you tell the child that Rover has a problem with his body is not well, you can say, the child is likely going to ask you, is he going to die? And you need to say, yes, Rover's going to die. We hope it's not going to be for a while. We hope we'll still have more time with Rover. But dogs, pets, animals who have this problem cannot live a long life. And then as you see Rover get sicker and sicker and not be able to function like Rover, your child is going to be asking you, is Rover dying? Is he going to die? And you're going to say, looks like he's getting ready. He is probably going to die, yes. But let's love him as much as we can while he's here. So then let's say you get to the point where Rover really is going to die, or maybe Rover died when your child was at school. Here's what I'm going to suggest. I think it's a good idea to say to a child after school, so it's not too sudden, or if in fact, even if it is sudden, to say, you know, I took Rover to the vet, and the vet said Rover really is very close to dying. But he's keeping him at the vet, and he's keeping him comfortable, and he gave him some medicine so he doesn't feel bad at all, and he's keeping his body calm. Now, Rover may already be dead, and yes, you are lying. but I'm helping you to help your child to understand it in a less severe way. And then later in the day, the next day in the morning, you can say, the vet called and he said that Rover died. Now this is going to open up a little can of worms in itself, because your child no doubt is going to say, I want to see him, or, well, where is he, or what's going to happen with him. I do not tell a child that animals' bodies often get cremated. And even though I know there is a pet cemetery, it's not a place that I suggest that you take your child to, any more than I suggest that you take your child on field trips to old people's homes so they can see old bodies, or to a cemetery to see where people's bodies go. I think that what you have to say to your child is, after Rover died, the vet put him in a container and took him to a place called a pet cemetery, where they take pets' all done bodies. And I think you can leave it at that. Work with that, play with it, say it however you want to say it. My best advice to you is certainly to avoid saying that he was cremated, and avoid saying that he's gone to the great doggy ranch in the sky. I think you need to be straight about it. I want to suggest that you have that pet funeral if it's a small pet that we can. Please avoid the burial at sea at all costs, because that isn't a very respectful way to treat a pet whom you've loved. But we can't bury cats and dogs in our yards. I believe it's against the law. So if your animal dies at home, you can explain that you're taking your bigger sized animal to the vet, and the vet is going to prepare his body and put it in that special container called a casket and take it to the pet cemetery. That's my best advice about that. But a child does have to learn what happens to people and what happens to pets after they die. Parents often ask me, should a child go to a funeral? And there are some who answer and say, absolutely not. I'm not taking a child to a funeral. Or sure, why not? I'm not going to tell you what you should or you shouldn't do. But what I'd like to tell you are the questions that you should ask yourself in order to determine whether you should involve a child in a funeral of probably a family member or a close person. Because if it's a neighbor down the street or someone he doesn't know very well, I really don't think there's much reason for the child to go. First of all, I would ask yourself, how old is the child? Is the child 2 years old? He doesn't need to go. If he's 3 years old, he doesn't need to go. There are no real rules here, but young children don't really need to go to funerals. You need to ask yourself, will the child's going to the funeral be more problematic than his not going? By that I mean, if your child goes to the funeral, is it going to get in your way of being able to mourn in the way that you need to? Because people go to funerals and they cry, and it's sad. And you need to be able to mourn in the way you need to mourn. And if you're feeling like you have to take care of your child, then it might not be a good idea to take your child to the funeral. The next question I would have you think about is, does your child want to go? If he doesn't want to go, then by all means, don't even bring it up. He doesn't have to go. You might want to ask yourself, 10 years from now, is your child going to say to you, I wanted to go to Grandpa's funeral and you wouldn't let me? And is that because all his other cousins are going to the funeral and he's not? Because often children, when there are a lot of cousins, feel left out. And sometimes the comfort of being with all the other cousins is comforting. And in fact, it might be a better thing to have everybody be together than not. So you have to consider that question also. Another question you ask yourself is, in considering if your child is going to go, and that he is old enough, and that he wants to go, is there someone who can actually look out for your child or take care of him at the funeral so he doesn't become your responsibility? Maybe it's a babysitter, Maybe it's an older cousin, but is there someone who can take care of his needs when he has to pee in the middle of the funeral or pick his nose or do all the things that kids need to do? If your child is going to go to the funeral, make sure that you explain to him what all the pre-funeral arrangements are. In other words, if there's a clergy person, a priest or a rabbi, someone who's going to come and talk with the family, include your child in that, because at those things, you talk about Grandpa, you talk about all the funny things and the sad things, and the child gets to process all those wonderful memories of Grandpa, and it's a good thing. I also suggest explaining to your child what happens at funerals. Saying something like, you know, a funeral is a place where people cry a lot. And when grown-ups cry, it's different than children crying. When they're really sad, sometimes it's really big boo-hoo crying, and it's surprising to kids who haven't seen that before. It's sometimes really disconcerting to see all these people he knows crying. So it's important to explain that that's going to happen. You can explain that the clergy person is going to say maybe some prayers. Maybe you'll sing some songs. If you're religious, there'll be some religious things that you do. And maybe some people will stand up and say memories about Grandpa that will make us all sad. But that's kind of our way of saying goodbye. If your child is going to be part of the internment when you lower the casket into the ground, that's something you're going to have to explain because that's really heavy duty. It's heavy duty for everyone, regardless of age. I have been at funerals where young children have actually been to an interment, and I'm not sure I support it, but it isn't my decision. But just know, if that's going to happen, that you will need to say to your child that when we're all done talking, the container called a casket is going to be lowered into the ground and dirt will be put on top of that casket. It's heavy duty. You need to say it in a way that isn't loaded and isn't scary, but you can give your child a choice about if he wants to see it or not. You know, it's a funny thing. Some kids will absolutely not want to see it. I don't want to see that. I don't want to go. And others will really want to see it. I want to see that because they're trying to understand it. And again, it's your decision. There are some parents who don't bring their children to the funerals at all, but choose to bring them to the after event, you know, the wake or the reception, whatever you call it, because at those things, people aren't so morose. They're eating and they're talking and they're remembering Grandpa in a more positive way. So consider it carefully. Consider explaining it to your child. But whether you take him to a funeral or not is only your choice. So I want to add on a couple of this as we conclude this seminar. A couple of things that I think it's important for you to know. I think it's really important for you to grieve in front of your children. Most parents want to cover their grief. They don't want their kids to see them crying. But you know, crying over death is an important part of dying. And children need to know that it's okay for everyone and anyone to feel sad and express it. And I say to kids all the time, crying is how we get the sad feelings out. We wash our sadness out. And even if you're still crying days, weeks, months later after a death, you can say to your child, I'm feeling sad. I'm remembering Dad. I'm remembering Grandpa. I'm remembering someone. And I'm having sad feelings. And you know me, I cry when I'm sad. It really is okay. Don't be put off if your child doesn't cry or isn't sad or doesn't express sadness the way you do. Children experience death and sadness very differently than adults do. They experience it in waves. They may feel sad and cry and be very upset, and the next moment be playing with their Legos. And then they may be sad again. They may experience their sadness in regressive behaviors, maybe starting to wet their bed, maybe having an inability to fall asleep at night, being regressive in their separation and needing you to stay home. experiencing fears of different kinds. But I know you'll be alert because you know that children really do experience and process these things very differently than adults do. Don't take refuge in silence. I know that when we're sad sometimes we're silent and we don't talk about it. But the more openly you talk about it, the more openly you remember the person who died, the less loaded death will be for your child, and the more able your child will feel to talk about death and to talk about what he's feeling. By the way, I believe this holds true with adults too. You know, sometimes adults don't know what to say to other adults about somebody who's died. They just kind of say, geez, I'm sorry to hear about your death, and they don't say anything. But people who are bereaved, people who are grieving, they may like to talk about it. They may need to talk about it. They love to hear stories. They love to hear the things that you remember about the person who has died. Because remember, that person is living on through your stories. And it actually brings comfort to people. So we want to teach children that there are ways that we commemorate people who have died. We can plant a tree. We can light a candle. And we explain to kids this is another way that we remember people who have died. And it's beautiful. And actually, I think that a wonderful thing to do to someone who is grieving is to bring them a plant, to plant in honor of a parent. And every time that rose blooms, he can think of his mom or his dad. It's what we do. Another thing we teach children is how we pay condolences and how we express condolences. Condolences are ways that we express our feelings to our kids. We show empathy and sympathy for the death and the loss that a person has experienced. They don't really understand or know how to do that, but it's important for them to see you doing that. I'm going to help Mrs. So-and-so. I'm going to do her marketing because she doesn't have anyone to help her do that anymore. Or let's bring a meal over to this house so the family doesn't have to cook. Or I'm going to help someone by doing her carpool so she can spend time at her mom's house. I talk to kids about how we bake bread, how we bake meals, how we're helpful to people who have died, because we express our sorrow with them by doing that. And we write them notes and we give them flowers. It's part of children's learning how we take care of people in this world. You can help your child to make a card, to bake cookies, and to bring them to the home of the bereaved person. But we model how we take care of people who are feeling sad. You know, there is no correct time or correct sequence of feelings for how people express grief. There certainly is no time limit on it. I do know that time seems to be the only thing that truly heals that kind of grief, and it takes different people different amounts of times to do so. But I can tell you that children will experience and process a death in their own way, in their own time. And acceptance and understanding is a process that unfolds over a period of time. So in conclusion, I hope that you've learned that learning about death and learning of all kinds is an ongoing process. It's a process about death that's going to unfold and build on itself with experience, with time for years and years. And you can expect that your child will come to understand in different ways, in different times, throughout his growing years. And you can also expect that he is going to ask his questions over and over again. I believe that if you can raise your child to revere life and to accept death as a fact, no one ever accepts death, but help him to understand that it is going to happen. You're going to educate your child for the present and protect her from the very worst, it's really not death, but the fear of death. We have hopefully helped our children to understand that it's a concept that has many parts, and you've explained to your child all those parts. And most importantly, you've made yourself available to answer questions, to share his anxieties, his worries about death. And in so doing, you're putting him or her in a great position to understand death and all kinds of questions he's going to have in the future.